Get ready for a deep dive into one of the wildest chapters in recent history, the rise and fall of Bimbini.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about a nation born from rebellion, fueled by ambition, and ultimately brought down by its own internal conflicts. You've given us a real mix of sources here.
Yeah.
Official declarations, personal letters, even some leaked intelligence reports.
Oh.
And piecing it all together is like solving a mystery where the clues keep changing.
It's fascinating because this isn't just a dry political story.
Right.
We're talking about real people making life or death decisions driven by ideology, revenge, and maybe even a little bit of madness.
Okay, so let's start back in 1995, long before the name Bimbini was even on the map.
Right.
You included this transcript of a meeting with Dr. Richard Bernaug, the man who would become Bimbini's leader.
Yeah.
And the Apocal Syndicate, his inner circle. What were they like in those early days?
Well, they were already causing major disruptions in Ediea.
Right.
But their strategy was more about exploiting weaknesses than outright violence. Think of it like a pressure campaign targeting key cities.
Okay.
They hit Bloxburg, where the government was already shaky.
Right.
Norte, which was a symbol of the monarchy.
Yeah.
Belasco, the capital itself.
Wow.
Each attack was carefully chosen to sow chaos and undermine Edeia's authority.
So they were playing a long game.
Yeah.
Almost like chess masters setting up their pieces.
Exactly.
But things eventually escalated, right?
Right.
How did they go from being seen as a disruptive political group to being labeled a terrorist organization?
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
Bernaug understood the power of public perception.
Initially,
he focused on tactics like propaganda,
right?
protests,
Yeah.
even cyber attacks,
Oh.
all designed to cripple Ediea without bloodshed. But as his methods became more extreme, the terrorist label started to stick. This meeting actually shows Bernaug trying to rein things in, realizing he needed to regain public support if he wanted to achieve his ultimate goal, Bimbini's independence.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a classic case of one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But then comes 2012 and the tragedy of Cedar Creek Flight 1551.
Yeah.
You included K.L. Coral's bulletin, released just hours after the plane was shot down.
Yeah.
It's incredibly raw, full of grief and rage.
That's the moment everything changed.
Yeah.
A Boeing 767 flying from Bloxburg to Miami was hit by a Quantum Aerospace GM-74VI missile.
Wow.
A model specifically designed for stealth and deniability. It crashed over Bimbini, killing all 164 people on board.
Oh, wow.
Including Kay Coral's father.
Right.
Suddenly, this conflict became deeply personal for one of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the world.
And she basically declared war on Benin right there in that bulletin, didn't she?
She threatened him directly.
Right.
Reminded him of the might of the Edian armed forces. And let's be honest. Also leveraged her status as the richest woman in the world.
Wow.
It was a power move. Pure and simple.
So how did Ediea, as a nation, respond? This must have been a defining moment for their leadership.
You're right.
Yeah.
The official declaration of war came shortly after, and it was a united front. President Killamost, Vice President McLean, King Abruzzi II, the entire cabinet.
Wow.
They all find it.
Yeah.
They cited Bimbini's unlawful secession, the attacks on their aircraft, and, of course, the label of terrorism as justification for war.
Right.
It was Ediea drawing a line in the sand.
We've gone from political maneuvering to all-out war in just a few years.
Yeah.
It's incredible how quickly things escalated.
It was a tense time.
Yeah.
For sure.
You must have been glued to the news back then.
And just a few years later, in 2015, we see Bernaug making a desperate plea for help. He writes a letter to none other than President Putin of Russia.
Wow.
Offering strategic resources and intelligence in exchange for support.
Wow, so he was willing to play on a global chessboard.
Yeah.
Making deals with major powers.
Yeah.
Was he truly that desperate, or was this a calculated gamble to draw Russia into the conflict?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It speaks to the pressure Bernaug was under. Remember, Ediea had launched a full-scale war against Bimbini, and they had powerful allies.
Right.
Bernaug's letter reveals just how high the stakes were becoming.
Yeah.
both for him personally and for the future of the nation he was trying to build.
And while all this was happening, Ediea was also caught up in a trade war with the U.S.
Right.
You included a transcript of a rather heated phone call between President Kilmost and President Trump.
Oh, yeah.
What can we learn from that conversation?
This is where we see the economic and political pressures really start to mount on Ediea. The trade war was causing serious damage to their economy.
Right.
And President Trump was applying immense pressure to get them to back down. Kilmost, however, was determined to protect Edian interests.
Right.
Even if it meant defying a superpower.
Wow.
It's a fascinating glimpse into the personalities involved.
Yeah.
And the high-stakes diplomacy happening behind the scenes.
So we've got Beamng trying to secure international allies, and Ediea facing economic and political pressure from the U.S.
Yeah.
But amidst all this maneuvering, what was happening inside Bimbini? Was it the utopia Beamng had promised?
Not quite.
Right.
Remember the 2021 Bimbini Airlines Flight 5 crash?
You provided a chilling report about that incident.
The plane was hijacked and deliberately flown into Bimbini's tallest building.
Oh, wow.
Killing 59 people.
Wow.
It was a horrific act of terrorism.
Right.
But more than that, it was a symptom of the growing internal turmoil Blai's regime was facing.
So the dream of a free Bimbini was starting to unravel.
Yeah.
How did Brog respond to this growing dissent?
His response was brutal.
Yeah.
He ordered mass executions in Lesfield, a town known for its opposition to his rule.
Wow.
This wasn't just a war against Ediea anymore.
Right.
It was a nation tearing itself apart. And just as these internal divisions reached a fever pitch, a shockwave hit the Edian monarchy. Remember, the attempted assassination of Queen Cassidy in 2023.
This is where the story takes a really dark turn.
It does.
You included news reports from the Firwood Broadcasting Company, and the details are just shocking.
The Queen was attacked while visiting a hospital in Belasco. The assailants, a couple named Ishaya and Brad Thompson, were quickly identified as members of the Apocalypse Syndicate.
Wow.
A nationwide manhunt ensued.
Yeah.
And the entire nation of Ediea rallied behind their wounded queen.
And this attack had a profound impact on the war, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was a shared sense of outrage.
Right.
And many believed that Beamng had finally gone too far. But then, as the queen clung to life, something unexpected happened. Both Ediea and Bimbini agreed to a temporary ceasefire for her funeral.
Wow.
It was a brief moment of unity.
Yeah.
Amidst all the bloodshed.
But then a bombshell revelation. Right. You mentioned that it turned out Bimbini wasn't actually behind the Queen's assassination attempt.
That's right.
Wow.
The investigation revealed that the Thompsons had acted on their own, driven by a twisted ideology that even Beamng himself condemned.
So if not Bimbini, then who was truly responsible?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And what were their motives?
It's like a layer of the mystery has just been peeled away.
Practically.
Only to reveal an even deeper conspiracy.
Yeah.
And as the nation mourned the loss of their queen, a new player entered the scene.
The queen's brother, King Lance Abruzzi,
King Lance,
ascended to the throne.
Right.
But his reign would be short-lived and even more chaotic than anyone could have imagined.
Oh, yeah.
This deep dive just keeps getting wilder. I can't wait to hear what happens next.
Well, buckle up, because King Lance's story is one you won't believe.
Last time we left off with King Lance Abruzzi taking the throne amidst chaos and uncertainty.
Right.
From what I've read, his reign was anything but smooth sailing.
Yeah.
What exactly happened during his brief time as king?
Well, imagine a nation still reeling from war.
Right.
Grieving the loss of their beloved queen. And suddenly thrust into a new era under a king whose views were, let's say, controversial.
You provided some news articles from that time.
Yeah.
And they paint a pretty traumatic picture.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like King Lance was on a collision course with his own people from the start.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He implemented a series of policies,
particularly regarding women's rights, that sparked widespread protests. Remember, this was a society that had just come through a traumatic conflict.
Right.
And they were looking for stability and healing.
Yeah.
Not more upheaval.
So King Lance was basically trying to impose his will.
Yeah.
On a nation that was already deeply divided and exhausted from war.
Yeah.
What was he thinking?
It's hard to say for sure.
Right.
But some political analysts believe he was trying to assert his authority. Perhaps overcompensating for his perceived weakness compared to his predecessor. Others suggest he was genuinely convinced that his policies were in the best interests of Ediea,
Right.
even if they were unpopular.
But the people weren't buying it.
No.
They took to the streets demanding his resignation.
Right.
What was his response?
Well,
Did he try to appease the protesters?
not exactly. King Lance, facing mounting pressure and fearing for his safety, made a drastic decision. He fled the country.
He fled.
Yeah.
A king running away from his own people.
I know.
That's something you'd expect to see in a movie, not real life.
I know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And the details of his escape are even more incredible.
Okay.
He broke into San Rafael National Airport.
Wow.
Commandeered a Lockheed P-3C Orion, a military transport plane, and took off into the night.
That's audacious.
I know.
Where was he even headed? Did he have a plan?
That was the mystery at the time.
Right.
There were rumors that he was flying to Canada, maybe seeking asylum in the U.S., or even trying to reach Mexico.
Wow.
His destination remained unknown for days, creating a global media frenzy.
And did he ever make it to any of those places?
Well, not quite.
Okay.
He ended up landing at Silverton International Airport in Johnson County,
a
relatively small regional airport in the U.S.
So this runaway king ends up in Johnson County.
I know.
Of all places.
Yeah.
What happened next? Did he try to blend in, start a new life?
Not at all. He was apprehended shortly after landing.
Oh, wow.
There were reports that authorities had been tracking his flight path and were waiting for him. Apparently, there were even attempts to intercept him in Boston and Kansas City.
Oh, really?
But he managed to evade them.
This whole story is wild.
Yeah.
You've got a runaway king, a stolen plane, international intrigue. It sounds like something out of a spy thriller.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it gets even stranger.
Okay.
Upon his arrest, King Lance reportedly made a chilling statement.
Okay, what's that?
I planned on taking over Johnson County as my own country.
What?
And running it how I wanted.
He was going to take over Johnson County?
Yeah.
Seriously?
That's what he said.
Wow.
Of course, it's hard to know if he was serious or just delusional.
Right.
But it certainly added to the drama.
Yeah.
And the questions surrounding his motives.
So we've got a runaway king. A failed attempt at a Johnson County coup. What does this all mean for Ediea?
Yeah.
Who's in charge now?
Well, with King Lance out of the picture.
Right.
His sister, Princess Carla.
Yeah.
Ascended to the throne.
Okay.
She immediately faced the daunting task of restoring order and stability to a nation that had been through so much turmoil.
Right.
But even as Ediea grappled with its internal struggles, there was still the unresolved issue of the war with Bimbini.
Right. The war, after all the drama with King Lance, it's easy to forget that there was still a conflict raging on.
Yeah, that's true.
What happened on that front?
Well, it seems like the events surrounding King Lance's flight and capture might have been a turning point. Remember, Ediea was facing a lot of international pressure to end the war, especially after the trade war, with the U.S. had strained relations with their most powerful ally.
Right.
And Bimbini, after years of fighting, was also feeling the strain. Their economy was in shambles, and public support for Bimbini was dwindling.
So both sides were essentially exhausted and looking for a way out.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Did they just agree to stop fighting and call it a day?
Not exactly. There were months of negotiations facilitated by the United Nations before a peace agreement was finally reached. It was signed in 2024 at the UN headquarters in Bloxburg and became known as the Treaty of Bloxburg.
That's significant. They chose a neutral location, signifying a commitment to peace from both sides.
Right.
What were the key provisions of this treaty?
Well,
what did it mean for Ediea and Bimbini?
The treaty was comprehensive, addressing everything from the ceasefire and demilitarization of Bimbini to the reconstruction efforts and future political arrangements. Bimbini was transferred to Bolingbroke Penitentiary in Ediea, effectively ending his reign.
Right.
It was a monumental shift, marking the official end of the conflict and the reunification of Bimbini with Ediea.
So after years of war, bloodshed, and political upheaval, Ediea and Bimbini were finally one nation again.
They were.
But I imagine the story doesn't end there, right?
No, of course not.
Signing a treaty is one thing. But actually achieving peace and reconciliation is a whole other challenge.
You're absolutely right. The Treaty of Bloxburg was just the beginning of a long and difficult process.
Right.
Rebuilding trust.
Yeah.
Healing the wounds of the past.
Yeah.
And addressing the underlying issues that led to the conflict in the first place.
Right.
Those were the challenges that lay ahead.
It sounds like Ediea was facing a massive task.
Yeah.
Where do they even begin to rebuild after all this?
Well, one of the first steps was to establish the Edian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was tasked with investigating the human rights abuses committed during the conflict, providing a platform for victims to share their stories, and ultimately seeking to foster healing and forgiveness.
That's a crucial part of any post-conflict reconciliation process, giving people a chance to be heard and to acknowledge the pain that was inflicted.
Exactly.
You provided some reports from the commission, and they're full of powerful testimonies.
They are.
What kind of stories are we talking about?
You have Edian citizens who lost loved ones in the downing of Cedar Creek Flight 1551, recounting their grief and anger.
Yeah.
Then there are Bimbini citizens who lived under Bernag's increasingly oppressive regime, sharing stories of fear, hardship, and the psychological scars of living in a society torn apart by violence.
It's a reminder that these weren't just abstract political events. They were deeply personal tragedies that impacted countless lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Commission's work was about more than just uncovering the truth. It was about acknowledging the pain. Validating the experiences of those who suffered, and ultimately creating a space for healing and forgiveness. It was a long and difficult process, but it was an essential step towards building a more just and peaceful future for Ediea.
But let's not forget about Dr. Beamng.
Yeah.
He was the architect of this whole conflict, the self-proclaimed leader of a nation that ultimately crumbled under his rule.
Yeah.
What became of him?
Well, according to the terms of the Treaty of Blalon, Beamng was extradited to Ediea and imprisoned in Bolingbroke Penitentiary, a maximum security facility known for housing some of the country's most dangerous criminals. You've provided some fascinating prison reports that shed light on his life behind bars.
I'm curious, what's it like for a man who once held so much power, who commanded a following, to be stripped of everything and confined to a cell?
It's a stark contrast, to say the least.
Yeah.
Some reports suggest he's shown remorse, expressing regret for the violence and suffering he caused. Others depict him as defiant, still clinging to his ideology, and even attempting to influence events from within prison.
It's like a real-life Shakespearean tragedy playing out. The once powerful leader, now reduced to a shadow of his former self. Grappling with the consequences of his actions.
It certainly raises questions about his true motivations. Was he genuinely seeking to improve the lives of Bimbini citizens, as he claimed? Or was it all a power grab fueled by ego and ambition? The prison reports give us glimpses into his psyche. But the full picture remains elusive.
And while Beamng was adjusting to life behind bars, Ediea had to face the daunting reality of rebuilding a nation shattered by war. We've talked about the emotional toll, but what about the economic impact?
The economic cost of the conflict was staggering.
Yeah.
Ediea was already dealing with the fallout of the trade war with the U.S., and now they had to rebuild Bimbini's infrastructure, provide aid to its citizens, and reintegrate its economy into their own. It was a massive undertaking.
You provided some economic analyses from that time, and they paint a pretty grim picture.
They do.
It must have been a challenge to balance the immediate needs of reconstruction with the long-term goal of economic stability.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Edian government had to make some tough choices. They raised taxes, cut spending in other areas, and even sought international loans to fund the reconstruction efforts.
Wow.
It was a delicate balancing act. Trying to meet the immediate needs of their people while ensuring long-term economic viability.
And it wasn't just about rebuilding physical infrastructure, right? There was also the challenge of reintegrating Bimbini's economy into Edia's. They had their own currency, their own trade agreements, their own way of doing things.
It wasn't just a matter of patching up roads and buildings. It was about merging two distinct economic systems. Which created its own set of complexities. It required careful planning, coordination, and a lot of compromise from both sides.
It sounds like an incredibly complex undertaking.
It was.
And on top of all that, Ediea also had to repair its reputation on the world stage. They had been involved in a protracted war,
Right.
a trade dispute with a superpower.
Uh-huh.
And then there was the whole King Lance fiasco.
Oh, yeah, it wasn't a good look.
That's right.
The conflict, coupled with King Lance's actions, had tarnished Edia's image internationally. They were seen as unstable, unpredictable, even rogue.
Wow.
They needed to rebuild trust with our allies, demonstrate their commitment to peace, and reassure the international community that they were a reliable partner.
So it wasn't just about internal reconciliation. It was also about mending fences on a global scale. How did they go about doing that?
It required a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
They engaged in extensive diplomacy, apologizing for past actions, reassuring their allies, and demonstrating their commitment to international cooperation. They also actively participated in UN peacekeeping missions. Provided humanitarian aid to other countries. And generally tried to project an image of stability and responsibility.
It sounds like they were going above and beyond to prove that they were worthy of trust and respect again.
They had a lot of work to do.
Did it work? Did the international community embrace Edia's efforts at redemption?
It was a gradual process.
Okay.
But we do see a shift in perceptions over time. As Edea implemented the terms of the Treaty of Blois, their commitment to peace and reconciliation became more evident. Their efforts to rebuild their economy and restore stability also contributed to a more positive image.
So they were working hard to put the pieces back together, both domestically and internationally.
But let's go back to the Treaty of Blois for a moment. You mentioned that one of the key provisions was the demilitarization of Bimbini. What exactly did that entail?
It was a massive undertaking. Imagine having to collect and decommission all those weapons. Dismantle military bases, and reintegrate former soldiers back into civilian life. It's not just a logistical challenge. It's also a social and psychological one.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
These are people who have been trained to fight, who may be struggling with trauma, who need support and guidance to transition back to a peaceful life.
Exactly.
How did they handle that aspect of the demilitarization process?
They recognized that it wasn't just about taking away weapons. It was about addressing the underlying issues that led people to take up arms in the first place. They established programs to provide vocational training, counseling, and job placement services for former soldiers.
They also work to create opportunities for economic development in areas that had been heavily militarized, providing alternative livelihoods and reducing the risk of people being drawn back into conflict.
So it was about more than just disarmament. It was about creating a new path forward for those who had been involved in the fighting.
Exactly.
But this whole process of demilitarization, reintegration, reconciliation, it must have been incredibly expensive.
It was.
Who footed the bill?
Well, Edea bore the brunt of the cost naturally. But they also received significant support from international organizations. Particularly the United Nations.
You mentioned that the UN played a key role in mediating the Treaty of Blois. Did they continue to be involved in the post-conflict phase?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The UN provided humanitarian aid, supported economic development projects, and helped to fund the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Wow.
They also played a vital role in monitoring the implementation of the peace agreement and ensuring that both sides were upholding their commitments.
So it sounds like the international community was invested in seeing Edea succeed in its efforts to rebuild and reconcile. But even with all this support, I imagine there were still challenges along the way.
There were.
What were some of the obstacles they faced?
One of the biggest challenges was addressing the deep-seated mistrust and resentment that lingered between former Bimbini and Edean citizens. Years of conflict. Propaganda and violence had created deep divisions. And bridging those divides was no easy feat.
It's not like you can just sign a peace treaty and expect everyone to suddenly forget about the past and embrace each other.
Exactly. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It also requires a concerted effort to promote dialogue, understanding, and empathy between different communities.
So it was about more than just rebuilding physical infrastructure.
It was.
It was about rebuilding relationships.
trust,
right,
and a shared sense of national identity.
Yeah.
That's a tall order for any nation,
Yeah.
let alone one that's just emerged from a devastating conflict.
It certainly was.
And it's important to remember that this process of reconciliation is ongoing.
Absolutely.
It's not something that happens overnight.
Right.
Or even over a few years. It's a long-term commitment that requires constant effort and vigilance.
Right.
It sounds like Ediea has come a long way since the dark days of the war with Bimbini.
They have.
But as you said, the journey is far from over.
Yeah, that's true.
What are some of the long-term challenges that they still face? What's the legacy of this conflict?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And one that we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
The war with Bimbini left an indelible mark on Ediea, shaping its political landscape, its social fabric, and its place in the world.
Right.
The aftershocks of that conflict continue to reverberate today.
And understanding those long-term consequences is crucial for understanding the Ediea of today.
This has been an incredible journey so far.
It has.
We've gone from the origins of the conflict to the signing of the peace treaty and the early stages of reconciliation.
Right.
It's a complex and fascinating story full of twists and turns, triumphs and tragedies. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
I agree.
I'm eager to hear what you have to say about the long-term consequences.
Okay.
And the enduring legacy of this tumultuous period in Edian history.
We'll get into all of that.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the seeds of discontent to the fragile peace that followed the Bimbini conflict. But as we all know, history doesn't just stop.
Right.
The echoes of those tumultuous years are still felt today in Ediea. So for this final part, let's shift our focus to the long-term consequences and the enduring legacy of the conflict.
You're right. The past isn't just something we read about in textbooks. It shapes the world we live in, even if we're not always aware of it.
Right.
And in Edia's case, the Bimbini conflict left a profound mark on everything from their national identity to their economy.
You provided some insightful articles written by Edian academics and political commentators. And one thing that really jumps out is the question of national identity.
Yeah.
How do you rebuild a sense of unity and shared purpose after such a divisive conflict?
It's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
You know, for years, Bimbini was portrayed as the enemy,
right,
a threat to Edia's stability and prosperity. Now, those same people are expected to simply become Edian citizens again.
Yeah.
It raises so many questions about how to reconcile the past with the present.
You're right. It's not a simple flip of a switch.
No.
How does Ediea address the fact that many Bimbini citizens may still harbor resentment or distrust towards the government that they once fought against?
Well, the article suggests that there's no single answer.
Right.
No magic formula.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing process that involves open dialogue, acknowledging past wrongs, and finding ways to celebrate the diversity of Edian culture while also emphasizing shared values and goals.
So it's about recognizing the distinct experiences of Bimbini citizens while also working towards a common future.
Exactly.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It is, and one of the key challenges is addressing the legacy of violence and trauma.
Right.
You can't just erase years of conflict and expect everyone to move on.
Yeah.
The psychological and emotional scars run deep. And they need to be addressed if you want to build a truly unified society.
That makes sense. It's not just about political agreements and economic policies. It's about healing the wounds of the past, both on an individual and a collective level.
Right.
But what about the other side of the equation? How has the Bimbini conflict shaped the way Ediea sees itself on the world stage?
That's another fascinating aspect. Before the war, Ediea had a relatively stable and positive image internationally.
Yeah.
They were seen as a reliable ally, a champion of democracy, a responsible member of the global community. But the conflict, and especially the trade war with the U.S., really damaged that reputation.
You included some diplomatic cables from the Edian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that really highlight the uphill battle they face in trying to repair their image.
They had to work hard to rebuild trust with their allies, to reassure the international community that they were committed to peace and stability. It involved a lot of apologies, a lot of demonstrating their commitment to international norms and agreements.
So it was a long process of rebuilding their credibility.
It was.
And proving that they were a trustworthy partner on the world stage.
Exactly.
Did they eventually succeed?
I think it's fair to say that they've made significant progress. They've shown a commitment to multilateralism. They've actively participated in peacekeeping efforts. They've provided humanitarian aid.
Right.
But the memory of the conflict lingers.
Yeah.
And it still influences how some nations view them.
That makes sense. It takes time to rebuild trust after something as significant as a war.
Right.
Especially when it involved actions that were controversial on the international stage.
Absolutely.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's been on my mind throughout this entire deep dive.
Okay.
What about the Apocal Syndicate? They played such a pivotal role in the Bimbini conflict, but with Binog behind bars, what's become of them?
Yeah.
Are they still a threat?
That's a question that intelligence agencies around the world are grappling with.
Right.
You've provided some fascinating reports from the Edian Spy Force, which is responsible for domestic intelligence gathering.
Right.
They suggest that the Apocal Syndicate is still active, but in a much more fragmented and less organized form.
So no longer the cohesive force they once were under Binog's leadership.
Right.
What are they doing now?
Well,
are they still trying to push for Bimbini's independence, or have their goals shifted?
It seems like there's no single answer.
Right.
Some factions have renounced violence.
Okay.
And are pursuing political avenues for change. They're advocating for greater autonomy for Bimbini within Ediea.
Right.
Focusing on things like economic development and cultural preservation.
So they're working within the system, trying to achieve their goals through peaceful means.
Exactly.
That makes sense, but I imagine there are still some elements that cling to Binog's more radical ideology.
Absolutely. The intelligence report suggests that some factions remain committed to the idea of a fully independent Bimbini.
Right.
And are willing to use violence to achieve that goal. They pose a real security threat.
Yeah.
And the Edian government is constantly working to monitor their activities and prevent them from regrouping or carrying out attacks.
It's a reminder that the roots of conflict run deep, and that achieving lasting peace requires addressing not just the immediate triggers of violence, but also the underlying grievances and ideologies that fuel those conflicts.
Yes.
But speaking of the future, what about the next generation? How are they being taught about this tumultuous period in Edian history?
You've included some curriculum guidelines from the Edian Ministry of Education that offer some fascinating insights into how they're approaching this sensitive topic.
Okay.
It's clear that they're trying to move away from simplistic narratives of good versus evil,
right,
and instead present a more nuanced and complex understanding of the conflict.
That's encouraging. It seems like they're trying to teach students to think critically about history,
right,
to understand the perspectives of all sides involved, and to learn from the mistakes of the past.
Exactly. They're emphasizing primary sources, encouraging debate and discussion, and focusing on the human cost of the conflict.
Right.
They're also teaching about the peace process, the challenges of reconciliation, and the importance of building a more just and inclusive society.
It sounds like they're really trying to equip the next generation with the tools to understand the complexities of their history and to build a better future.
Okay.
But let's be realistic, even with the best intentions.
Yeah.
There are going to be challenges.
Right.
What are some of the long-term economic issues facing Ediea as a result of the Bimbini conflict?
You're right. The economic legacy of the conflict is significant. We've already talked about the cost of rebuilding Bimbini, but there are also broader issues to consider.
Right.
For example, the trade war with the U.S. had a devastating impact on certain sectors of the Edian economy.
Yeah.
And those effects are still being felt today.
You provided some economic forecasts from the Edian Central Bank. And they paint a somewhat mixed picture.
They do. There's some optimism about the long-term growth potential of a reunified Ediea.
Right.
But there are also concerns about income inequality, regional disparities, and the need to diversify the economy.
So it sounds like they're facing some classic post-conflict economic challenges.
Rebuilding infrastructure, creating jobs, addressing inequality, and finding ways to stimulate sustainable growth.
Exactly. And on top of that, they have to deal with the lingering effects of the trade war and the uncertainty of the global economic landscape.
Right.
It's a complex set of challenges that requires careful planning, strategic investment, and a commitment to equitable development.
It's clear that Ediea is still grappling with the consequences of the Bimbini conflict, both in terms of its national identity and its economic well-being. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to one final figure who played a unique and some might say bizarre role in this whole saga.
Okay.
King Lance.
King Lance.
What's the lasting impact of his brief and chaotic reign?
King Lance, the runaway king, the Johnson County conqueror.
Right.
It's hard to overstate the damage he did to the monarchy and to Edia's image in general.
You included some political science papers analyzing the long-term impact of his actions.
Right.
And they suggest that he basically undermined the legitimacy of the monarchy, fueled anti-royalist sentiments, and contributed to a general distrust of the government.
They do. His actions raise serious questions about the stability and competence of the Edian leadership. And when people see their leaders acting recklessly and self-servingly, it erodes their faith in the entire system.
So even though he's no longer on the throne, his legacy continues to cast a shadow over Edian politics.
It does.
It's a reminder that actions have consequences.
Yeah.
And that even those in positions of power are not above the law or the will of the people.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure.
Yeah.
And it underscores the importance of strong institutions, checks and balances, and a culture of accountability to prevent such abuses of power from happening again.
Well, this has been an incredible journey.
It has been.
We've explored the rise and fall of Bimbini, the complexities of conflict and reconciliation.
The human stories woven into this historical tapestry, and the long-term consequences that continue to shape Edea today. It's been eye-opening to say the least.
It has.
Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive.
My pleasure.
It's given me a whole new perspective on Edea and the challenges they face.
I'm glad to hear that.
And for those of you listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about Edea and the Bimbini conflict. Keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and keep learning from the past to shape a better future. Until next time, happy diving.